Sarah Martinez walked through the doors of Henderson Community College with her head held high, though her stomach churned with familiar anxiety. At 28, she was older than most students, and the weight of curious stares followed her down the hallway. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain blue sweater that concealed the stories etched into her skin. The psychology classroom buzzed with pre-lecture chatter as Sarah found a seat in the middle row. She preferred not to sit too close to the front where professors might single her out, but not so far back that she seemed disinterested. As a veteran using her GI Bill benefits, she took her education seriously. "All right, everyone, settle down," Professor Williams called out, adjusting his glasses. "Today we're discussing trauma and its psychological effects. Can anyone share what they know about post-traumatic stress disorder?" Several hands shot up around the room. A young man in a Letterman jacket spoke confidently about what he'd read in their textbook. A girl with perfectly styled blonde hair mentioned a documentary she'd watched. The discussion continued with academic theories and secondhand knowledge. When the topic shifted to combat trauma, Sarah noticed how the conversation became more detached, almost clinical. Students spoke about soldiers as if they were case studies rather than real people with real experiences. "It's mostly men who experience combat PTSD," declared Jessica, a sorority member who always sat in the front row. "I mean, women aren't really in combat situations, right? They're usually in support roles or safe areas." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She'd learned early in her college journey that correcting misconceptions often led to uncomfortable conversations she wasn't ready to have. "Actually," Professor Williams interjected gently, "women have served in combat roles more frequently than many people realize, especially in recent conflicts. The lines between combat and non-combat zones have become increasingly blurred." Marcus, a cocky sophomore who enjoyed being the center of attention, laughed dismissively. "Come on, Professor. No offense, but women just aren't built for real combat. They might be there, but they're not doing the heavy lifting. Real combat is something else entirely." Several students nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt her hands clench into fists under her desk. She thought about the weight of her rifle during 12-hour patrols, the sound of incoming mortars that made everyone dive for cover regardless of gender, the friends she'd lost who happened to be women. The professor tried to steer the conversation back to the psychological aspects of trauma, but the damage was done. Sarah spent the rest of the class period staring at her notebook, only half listening as her classmates continued to discuss combat veterans as abstract concepts, rather than people who might be sitting right next to them. After class, Sarah gathered her books quickly, hoping to avoid any further discussion, but as she walked toward the door, she overheard Jessica talking to her friends. "I just think it's important to be realistic about these things," Jessica was saying. "My boyfriend is in ROTC, and he's always talking about how physically demanding real military operations are. Women might serve, but they're not exactly Navy SEALs, you know." Her friends giggled in agreement, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with frustration. She'd never claimed to be a Navy SEAL, but she'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, leading convoys through hostile territory and engaging in firefights that had tested every limit she thought she had. The hallway felt suffocating as Sarah made her way to her next class. She'd chosen this college specifically because it was small and supposedly welcoming to veterans. The VA counselor had assured her that transitioning to civilian life and education would be challenging but manageable. Nobody had prepared her for the casual dismissal of her experiences by people who had never left their comfortable suburban lives. In her American history class, the discussion inevitably turned to recent military conflicts. Sarah found herself in the familiar position of listening to classmates debate the effectiveness of military strategies they'd read about online or seen in movies. Their confidence in discussing matters they'd never experienced firsthand was both impressive and infuriating. "The problem with our military strategy was that we weren't aggressive." "Enough," proclaimed David, a business major who drove a BMW his parents had bought him. "If we'd really gone in there and shown them what American firepower could do, we would have wrapped up those conflicts years ago." Sarah bit her tongue as David continued his armchair analysis, describing complex geopolitical situations as if they were video game scenarios. She remembered the faces of Afghan children who had waved at her convoy, the local interpreters who had risked their lives to help American forces, the impossible decisions that had to be made in seconds with incomplete information. The frustration built throughout the day as Sarah encountered more well-meaning but ignorant comments about military service. During lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, watching groups of traditional college students laugh and complain about professors and upcoming exams. Their biggest worries seemed to revolve around social media drama and weekend party plans. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her VA therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, reminding her about their appointment that afternoon. She appreciated the regular check-ins, but she wasn't sure how to explain this particular type of stress. How do you tell someone that the hardest part of being a veteran isn't dealing with your own trauma, but dealing with people who dismiss that trauma because you don't fit their expectations of what a combat veteran should look like? As she walked across campus after her last class, Sarah noticed a group of students gathered around a table, promoting various clubs and organizations. A sign reading "Support Our Troops" caught her eye, and she slowed down to listen to their conversation. "We're organizing care packages for deployed soldiers," explained the enthusiastic freshman. "You know, the real heroes fighting overseas. It's the least we can do for the brave men risking their lives for our freedom." The automatic assumption that all combat soldiers were men stung, but Sarah had heard it countless times before. She considered approaching the table, maybe offering to help with their care package initiative, but she could already imagine the awkward silence that would follow if she mentioned her own service record. Instead, she continued walking toward the parking lot, where her used Honda Civic waited among the newer cars driven by students whose biggest financial concern was whether their parents would increase their monthly allowance. Sarah's education was funded by benefits she'd earned through service in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, but to her classmates she was just another older student who probably couldn't relate to their experiences. The drive home gave her time to decompress and prepare for her therapy appointment. Dr. Rodriguez would ask about her week, and Sarah would have to decide how much to share about the growing frustration she felt at being surrounded by people who honored military service in the abstract while dismissing the reality of her own experiences. Dr. Rodriguez's office felt like a sanctuary compared to the college campus. The soft lighting and comfortable chairs created an atmosphere where Sarah could finally let her guard down. She'd been seeing Dr. Rodriguez for 8 months ever since she'd started college, and their sessions had become an anchor in her weekly routine. "How was your week, Sarah?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, settling into her chair with Sarah's file balanced on her lap. Sarah recounted the classroom discussions and the casual assumptions her classmates made about military service. Dr. Rodriguez listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "It sounds like you're feeling invisible," Dr. Rodriguez observed. "Like your experiences aren't being acknowledged or validated." "Exactly," Sarah said, leaning forward in her chair. "They talk about supporting the troops, but they can't even imagine that one of those troops might be sitting right next to them. And when they do think about women in the military, they assume we were all filing paperwork in air-conditioned offices." Dr. Rodriguez made a note. "Have you considered sharing your experiences with your classmates? It might help them understand a different perspective." Sarah laughed bitterly. "And say what? Actually, I was there and you're wrong. They'd probably think I was making it up, or they'd ask me to prove it somehow. I've seen how people react when their assumptions get challenged." The conversation continued for another 40 minutes, with Dr. Rodriguez gently exploring Sarah's feelings of isolation and frustration. By the time Sarah left the office, she felt somewhat better, but the underlying problem remained unchanged. The next few weeks at college followed a similar pattern. In her sociology class, students discussed gender roles and inequality, with the passionate certainty of people who had read about social issues but never lived them. Sarah listened to debates about workplace discrimination and the glass ceiling, knowing that her own professional challenges had involved very different types of barriers. During a group project about social justice movements, Sarah found herself partnered with 3 younger students who were enthusiastic about various causes. Emma, a women's studies major, spoke passionately about breaking down gender stereotypes and challenging societal expectations. "Women need to be seen as capable of anything men can do," Emma declared during one of their project meetings. "We're just as strong, just as brave, just as competent in any field." Sarah agreed with the sentiment, but she noticed how Emma's examples were always hypothetical or drawn from historical figures. When the conversation turned to contemporary examples of women in traditionally male-dominated fields, the discussion remained abstract. "I think the military is still really behind in terms of gender equality," said Tyler, their third group member. I mean, they only recently started letting women serve in combat roles, right? And I bet there's still a lot of resistance from the old boys club. Sarah's project partner, Jake, nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, and I'm sure the physical demands are still a barrier. Like, I'm not trying to be sexist, but there are real biological differences that matter in combat situations. Emma bristled at this comment, launching into a heated discussion about societal conditioning and the myth of inherent physical limitations. Sarah found herself in the strange position of listening to her group members debate her own capabilities and experiences, as if she weren't sitting right there. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was Emma, fighting for women's equality and recognition, while simultaneously failing to recognize that one of the women she was advocating for was sitting across from her. And Jake, despite his claim of not wanting to be sexist, was making assumptions about physical limitations based on generalizations rather than individual experience. As the project progressed, Sarah contributed her research and ideas without revealing the personal connection she had to their topic. They were studying the integration of women into combat roles, and Sarah had to bite her tongue as her group members speculated about challenges and experiences she knew firsthand. The final presentation went well, with their group receiving positive feedback from Professor Chen. Emma had been the primary presenter, and she delivered their findings with the confidence of someone who had thoroughly researched her subject. Their classmates asked thoughtful questions about policy changes and implementation challenges. After class, Emma approached Sarah with obvious excitement. I think our presentation really opened some eyes, she said. A lot of people don't realize how much progress has been made in military gender integration. I'm thinking about focusing my senior thesis on this topic. Sarah nodded politely, wondering what Emma would think if she knew she was talking to someone who had lived through that integration process firsthand. Would Emma see her as a valuable source of primary information? Or would she be skeptical of Sarah's experiences because they didn't match her preconceived notions? The question became more pressing when Emma suggested they continue working together on related projects. You seem really knowledgeable about military culture, Emma observed. Have you done a lot of research on this topic? Sarah hesitated, weighing her options. She could continue to let Emma assume her knowledge came from academic research, or she could reveal the truth and deal with whatever reaction followed. Before she could decide, Tyler joined their conversation. Emma's becoming a real expert on women warriors, Tyler said with a grin. She's been reading everything she can find about female soldiers and combat veterans. I think she's planning to interview some real veterans for her thesis. The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was Emma, passionate about advocating for women like her, planning to seek out interviews with people who had exactly the experiences Sarah carried with her every day. Yet Emma couldn't see that one of those people was standing right in front of her. Sarah mumbled an excuse about needing to get to her next class and quickly gathered her things. As she walked away, she heard Emma telling Tyler about her plans to contact local veteran organizations to find interview subjects for her research. The Campus Counseling Center had become another refuge for Sarah during particularly difficult weeks. Unlike her VA therapy sessions, which focused on her overall adjustment to civilian life, the college counselors helped her navigate the specific challenges of being a non-traditional student. I keep feeling like I'm living a double life, Sarah explained to Monica, the counselor she'd been seeing since midterm stress had become overwhelming. I have all these experiences that are relevant to my classes, but I can't share them without completely changing how people see me. Monica, who was only a few years older than Sarah, listened with genuine interest. What do you think would happen if you did share more about your background? Sarah had thought about this question many times. Some people would probably be supportive, maybe even interested, but others would start treating me differently. They'd either put me on a pedestal as some kind of hero, which I'm not, or they'd start questioning everything I say, looking for proof that I'm telling the truth. Both of those reactions would be uncomfortable, Monica acknowledged. Exactly. And then there's the group that would suddenly want to know all the gory details. They'd ask about the worst things I've seen or done, like my trauma is entertainment for them. The conversation helped Sarah understand why she'd been keeping her military background so private. But it didn't resolve the growing tension she felt between her authentic self and the persona she maintained at college. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, looking through old photos on her laptop. Pictures from her deployment showed her in full combat gear, leading her squad through Afghan villages, sharing meals with fellow soldiers who had become family. In contrast, photos from college events showed her smiling politely at study groups and campus activities, always slightly apart from her classmates. The disconnect between these two versions of herself was becoming harder to maintain. Every classroom discussion about military service, every casual assumption about women's roles in combat, every well-meaning but ignorant comment from her peers added to the weight she carried. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed it was Miguel, one of her former squad members who was now attending college in Texas. "Hey, Martinez." Miguel's familiar voice brought an instant smile to Sarah's face. "How's the college life treating you?" They talked for an hour about their respective schools, the challenges of adjusting to civilian education, and the strange experience of being surrounded by people who had never left their home states, let alone served overseas. "Do you ever feel like telling them?" Miguel asked when Sarah described her latest classroom experiences. "Every day," Sarah admitted. "But I just don't know if it's worth the hassle." "Maybe it's not about them," Miguel suggested. "Maybe it's about you. You earned the right to own your story, Martinez. Don't let a bunch of kids who don't know any better make you feel like you have to hide who you are." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, Miguel's words echoing in her mind. She had spent so much energy trying to fit in, trying to be just another student, that she'd forgotten the strength and pride she'd once felt in her service and her identity as a veteran. The breaking point came during a particularly frustrating week in November. Sarah's American literature class was discussing war poetry, and Professor Davis had assigned readings from various conflicts, including recent works by Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. These contemporary pieces lacked the sophistication of classical war poetry, declared Brittany, an English major who prided herself on her literary analysis skills. "They're too raw, too emotional. Real literature requires more artistic distance from the subject matter." Sarah felt her pencil snap in her grip as Brittany continued her critique. "I mean, you can tell these were written by people who were actually there, but that doesn't automatically make them good poetry. Being a veteran doesn't make you a poet." The professor tried to guide the discussion toward the literary merit of authentic experience versus artistic technique, but several students sided with Brittany's assessment. They preferred the elevated language and universal themes of older war poetry to what they saw as the crude realism of contemporary veteran writers. "It's like they're just complaining," added Kevin, a philosophy major who enjoyed playing devil's advocate in class discussions. "War is horrible, we get it. But where's the deeper meaning? Where's the hope or redemption or lesson for humanity?" Sarah's hands trembled as she listened to her classmates dismiss the authentic voices of her generation of veterans as artistically inferior. These were poems written by people who had experienced things these students couldn't imagine. Yet they were being critiqued by people whose biggest hardship was a difficult exam or a complicated relationship. When class ended, Sarah remained in her seat as her classmates filed out, still debating the relative merits of different poetic approaches to war. Professor Davis noticed her sitting there and approached with concern. "Sarah, are you all right? You seemed upset during our discussion." For a moment, Sarah considered opening up to Professor Davis, who had always seemed more perceptive than some of her other instructors. But the moment passed, and she simply nodded and gathered her books. The campus felt different as Sarah walked to her next class. Every conversation she overheard seemed to reinforce the divide between her experiences and those of her classmates. Students complained about minor inconveniences with the intensity she once reserved for life-threatening situations. In her psychology class, the topic was stress management and coping mechanisms. Students shared their strategies for dealing with academic pressure, relationship problems, and family expectations. The discussion was earnest and well-meaning, but Sarah found herself fighting back bitter laughter at the contrast between their stressors and her own. "I use meditation apps when I'm feeling overwhelmed," shared Ashley, a pre-med student. "It really helps me center myself when everything feels chaotic." "Exercise is my go-to," said Brandon. "When I'm stressed about grades or whatever, I hit the gym and just push through it." Professor Williams asked if anyone had experience with more intensive forms of stress or trauma. The room fell silent, and Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the classroom, though she knew they weren't actually looking at her. In their minds, real trauma was something that happened to other people. Somewhere else to someone else after class, Sarah found herself walking aimlessly around campus instead of heading to the library as planned. The early November air was crisp and the changing leaves reminded her of autumn in Afghanistan, though the similarities ended there. Here, students worried about midterm exams and holiday plans. Their autumn had meant different challenges entirely. She ended up at the Student Veterans Office, a small space tucked away in the basement of the administration building. Sarah rarely visited, preferring to handle her benefits paperwork online. But today she needed to be somewhere that acknowledged her identity as a veteran. Dave Harrison, the veterans coordinator, looked up from his desk with surprise. "Sarah, good to see you. What brings you by?" Dave was a Vietnam veteran in his 60s, and his office walls were covered with photos from various military conflicts and veteran graduation ceremonies. It was one of the few spaces on campus where Sarah felt her background was understood and respected. "Just needed a break from campus life," Sarah said, settling into the worn chair across from Dave's desk. Dave studied her with the keen perception of someone who had navigated his own difficult transition from military to civilian life. "Rough day?" Sarah found herself telling Dave about the literature class discussion and the general frustration she'd been feeling. Dave listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in recognition. "I hear this from a lot of our younger veterans," Dave said when Sarah finished, "especially the women. People have very specific ideas about what a veteran looks like and what kind of experiences count as real military service. It's like I'm invisible," Sarah said. "They talk about supporting veterans, but they can't see one sitting right in front of them." Dave reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "You might be interested in this. We're organizing a Veterans Day panel discussion next week. The idea is to have veterans from different eras and branches share their experiences with the campus community." Sarah looked at the flyer Dave handed her. The panel was scheduled for the week after Veterans Day, and they were still looking for participants from recent conflicts. "I don't know," Sarah said hesitantly. "Public speaking isn't really my thing." "Think about it," Dave suggested. "Sometimes the best way to deal with being invisible is to make yourself visible on your own terms." That evening, Sarah called her sister Maria, who lived across the country with her family. Maria was one of the few people who understood both versions of Sarah's life, the soldier and the student. "I feel like I'm going crazy," Sarah confessed as she paced around her small apartment. "I sit in these classes listening to people talk about things they know nothing about, and I can't say anything without completely changing the dynamic." "Why can't you change the dynamic?" Maria asked. "Maybe it needs to be changed." "Because then I become the veteran," Sarah explained. "Everything I say gets filtered through that lens. Every opinion I have gets categorized as a veteran perspective instead of just Sarah's perspective." Maria was quiet for a moment. "Remember when you first enlisted? You were so proud to serve. You wanted to make a difference. Maybe this is another way to make a difference." After the call, Sarah sat with Dave's flyer on her coffee table, staring at the details about the Veterans Day panel. The theme was Service and Sacrifice, Veterans' Voices in the Modern Era. She imagined herself sitting at a table in front of an auditorium full of students, faculty, and community members, sharing her experiences for the first time in a public forum. The idea terrified her, but it also sparked something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. Miguel's words echoed in her mind about owning her story and not letting others make her feel like she had to hide who she was. Saturday morning brought Sarah's weekly grocery shopping trip, a mundane task that usually provided a peaceful break from campus life. But as she pushed her cart through the store, she overheard a conversation between two women who appeared to be professors from the college. "The Veterans Day assembly should be interesting," one was saying, "though I hope it's not too political. These military events can sometimes get a bit heavy-handed with the patriotism." "I know what you mean," her companion replied. "I'm all for honoring service, but I prefer when these things focus on the historical perspective, rather than getting too personal or emotional." Sarah abandoned her shopping cart and left the store, her hands shaking with anger and frustration. Even the faculty seemed to view veteran experiences as something to be managed and sanitized, rather than genuinely understood. Back in her apartment, Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing an email to Dave Harrison. She wrote several drafts, deleting and rewriting her thoughts multiple times. Finally, she settled on a simple message. "I'd like to participate in the Veterans Day panel. Let me know what information you need from me." She hit send before she could change her mind, then immediately regretted the decision. What if she froze up during the presentation? What if the audience reacted with the same dismissive attitudes she'd encountered in her classes? What if sharing her story only made things worse? But it was too late to take it back. Dave responded within an hour, expressing enthusiasm for her participation and providing details about the format and expectations. The panel would include 5 veterans from different conflicts, each speaking for about 10 minutes before taking questions from the audience. Sarah spent Sunday researching the other panel participants. There was Dave himself, representing Vietnam veterans, Carol Chen, a Gulf War Navy veteran, Robert Williams, who had served in Iraq, and James Thompson, a World War II veteran in his 90s who rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. Reading their brief biographies, Sarah realized she would be the only woman combat veteran on the panel, and likely the youngest participant. The weight of representation settled on her shoulders as she began to think about what story she wanted to tell. Mondays, classes felt different as Sarah sat through familiar discussions about military service and veteran experiences. Instead of the helpless frustration she usually felt, she found herself taking mental notes about. The week leading up to the Veterans Day panel was the longest of Sarah's college experience. She spent hours crafting her presentation, wrestling with how much to reveal and how personal to make her story. Every draft felt either too clinical or too raw, too general or too specific. Dave had given her guidelines about keeping the presentation appropriate for a general audience, avoiding graphic details, and focusing on the broader themes of service and transition to civilian life. But Sarah struggled with how to convey the reality of her experiences without sanitizing them beyond recognition. On Tuesday evening, she sat in her apartment with printed copies of her various drafts spread across her coffee table. Her laptop screen showed a blank document titled Final Draft Veterans Panel, and the cursor blinked mockingly at her. Her phone rang, showing Miguel's number. She answered gratefully, needing the distraction. "How's the speech coming?" Miguel asked without preamble. He'd been checking in regularly since she'd told him about the panel. "I keep second-guessing everything," Sarah admitted. "How do you explain what it was like over there to people who think war is what they see in movies?" "You tell the truth," Miguel said simply. "Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized version, just the truth. They can handle it, and if they can't, that's their problem. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm exaggerating or trying to get attention?" Miguel was quiet for a moment. "Martinez, do you remember Lieutenant Rodriguez? How she used to say that our job wasn't to make people comfortable with the truth, just to tell it." Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been their commanding officer during their second deployment, a tough woman who had never backed down from difficult conversations or hard truths. She also said that people who can't handle reality shouldn't be making decisions about it. Sarah remembered, exactly. These students, these professors, they're going to be voters, leaders, maybe even policymakers someday. They need to know what military service actually looks like, especially for women. You're not doing this for them. You're doing it for the next generation of women who serve. After the call, Sarah felt more focused. She opened a new document and began writing, not as a student trying to fit in, but as a veteran with a story that needed to be told. Wednesday's classes provided unexpected inspiration for her presentation. In her sociology class, Professor Martinez was discussing social identity and the challenges faced by individuals who don't fit expected categories. Sometimes people become invisible not because they're actually absent, but because others can't see past their own assumptions, Professor Martinez explained. This happens frequently with individuals whose identities challenge societal stereotypes. Sarah realized this was exactly what she'd been experiencing. Her classmates couldn't see her as a combat veteran because she didn't match their mental image of what a combat veteran looked like. She'd been invisible not because she was hiding, but because they couldn't see past their assumptions. During her American literature class, Professor Davis announced that they would be having a follow-up discussion about war poetry the following week, after the Veterans Day events. "I encourage everyone to attend the Veterans Panel," Professor Davis said. "It might provide some additional context for our literary discussions." Sarah caught Brittany rolling her eyes at this suggestion, clearly uninterested in hearing from actual veterans about their experiences. Kevin made a joke about getting extra credit for attendance, and several students laughed. Thursday brought Sarah's regular therapy session with Dr. Rodriguez, who had been following her progress with keen interest. "You seem different today," Dr. Rodriguez observed as Sarah settled into her chair. "More focused, maybe more determined." Sarah described her decision to participate in the panel and the week she'd spent preparing her presentation. Dr. Rodriguez listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about Sarah's motivations and expectations. "What do you hope to accomplish with this presentation?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "I want them to see me," Sarah said simply. "Not as a symbol or a stereotype, but as a real person who happens to be a veteran. I want them to understand that their assumptions might be wrong. And what if they still don't see you the way you want to be seen?" Sarah considered this question carefully. "Then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll have told my story on my own terms instead of letting other people tell it for me." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "That sounds like a very healthy perspective. You're taking control of your narrative instead of letting others control it for you." Friday evening, Sarah had her final preparation session with the other panel participants. They met in Dave's office to review the format and practice their presentations. Sarah was nervous about sharing her draft with the group, but their feedback was encouraging and supportive. Carol Chen, the Gulf War Navy veteran, nodded approvingly as Sarah finished reading her presentation. "You found a good balance," Carol said. "Personal enough to be meaningful but professional enough for the setting." James Thompson, the World War II veteran, had been quiet during most of the preparation session, but he spoke up after Sarah's practice run. "Young lady, your generation of veterans faces challenges we never had to deal with," he said thoughtfully. "The public's relationship with the military is more complicated now, and women's roles have expanded in ways we couldn't have imagined. Your voice is important." Robert Williams, the Iraq veteran, agreed. "People need to hear from women who served in combat roles. The stereotypes and assumptions you're talking about, I see them all the time. Even other veterans sometimes don't get it." Dave wrapped up the session with final logistics and reminders about the panel format. "Remember, we're not here to change anyone's mind about military policy or politics," he said. "We're here to share our experiences and help people understand the human side of military service." Saturday morning, Sarah woke up feeling more nervous than she had since her first day of college. The panel was scheduled for Monday afternoon, and she spent the weekend alternating between confidence in her decision and terror at the prospect of speaking publicly about her experiences. She called Maria on Sunday afternoon, needing the support of someone who understood both her military background and her current struggles. "I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong," Sarah confessed. "What if I start crying? What if someone asks a question I can't answer? What if they think I'm making it all up?" "Sarah, you've been through literal combat," Maria reminded her. "You can handle a room full of college students and professors. And if someone doesn't believe you, that says more about them than it does about you. I know you're right, but this feels harder than combat in some ways. At least over there I knew who the enemy was." Maria laughed softly. "The enemy here isn't your classmates or your professors. The enemy is ignorance and assumptions, and you're about to go to war against those." Sunday evening, Sarah laid out her clothes for the panel. A simple blue blouse and black slacks, professional but not too formal. She'd decided against wearing anything that might be seen as trying too hard to look military or civilian. She read through her presentation one final time, making minor adjustments to the flow and timing. The speech was exactly 10 minutes long, as requested, and covered her enlistment, deployment experiences, and transition to college life without getting into graphic details or political commentary. The opening focused on challenging assumptions about women in combat roles. The middle section described the reality of military service for women, including both the challenges and the camaraderie. The conclusion addressed the transition to civilian life and the importance of recognizing diverse veteran experiences. As Sarah prepared for bed, she thought about all the classroom discussions she'd sat through in silence, all the assumptions she'd heard without challenging, all the times she'd felt invisible and misunderstood. Tomorrow she would finally have the chance to be seen and heard on her own terms. She set her alarm earlier than usual, planning to arrive at campus with plenty of time to spare. The panel was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main auditorium, and Dave had mentioned that several classes were planning to attend, along with community members and other students. Sarah's last thought before falling asleep was of Lieutenant Rodriguez and her philosophy about telling the truth regardless of whether people were comfortable hearing it. Tomorrow, Sarah would honor that philosophy and finally own her story instead of letting others tell it for her. The morning would bring the culmination of months of frustration and the beginning of a new chapter in her college experience. Whether her classmates would listen and learn remained to be seen, but Sarah was finally ready to find out. She was ready to stop being invisible and start being seen for who she really was, not despite her military service, but because of it. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather for November, and Sarah took it as a good omen. She dressed carefully, choosing her outfit not as a student trying to blend in, but as a veteran preparing to share her story with dignity and authenticity. The campus felt different as Sarah walked to her morning classes. Students were posting flyers about Veterans Day events, and she noticed more American flag pins and Support Our Troops ribbons than usual. The irony wasn't lost on her that people were showing support for veterans while remaining unaware that they interacted with them daily. In her psychology class, Professor Williams mentioned the afternoon panel during his opening announcements. "I encourage everyone to attend today's veterans presentation," he said. "It will provide valuable insights into the psychological aspects of military service and transition that we've been discussing." Marcus raised his hand. "Will there be any actual combat veterans or just support personnel?" The question made Sarah's jaw clench, but today the familiar irritation was mixed with anticipation. In a few hours, Marcus would get his answer. "The panel includes veterans from various roles and conflicts," Professor Williams replied diplomatically. "I think you'll find their perspectives enlightening." During lunch, Sarah sat in the cafeteria with her prepared remarks, reviewing them one final time. She'd memorized most of the speech, but she wanted the written version as backup in case nerves affected her concentration. Emma from her sociology group spotted her and approached with enthusiasm. "Sarah, are you going to the veterans panel this afternoon? I'm thinking about doing my senior thesis on women's integration into combat roles. So this should be really informative." Sarah looked up at Emma, this passionate advocate for women's equality who had spent weeks researching the very experiences Sarah had lived. "I'll be there," Sarah said simply. "I'm hoping they have at least one female veteran on the panel," Emma continued. "So much of what we hear about military service comes from a male perspective. It would be great to hear from a woman who actually served in a combat zone." "I think you'll get what you're looking for," Sarah replied, a small smile playing at her lips. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah made her way to the auditorium where the panel would take place. The backstage area was set up with chairs for the participants, and Dave was making final sound checks with the audio technician. The other panel members were already there, reviewing their notes and making small talk. "How are you feeling?" Carol Chen asked as Sarah took her seat. "Nervous but ready," Sarah admitted. "It's time to stop being invisible." Through the curtains, Sarah could see the auditorium filling up. She recognized several of her classmates, including Emma, Marcus, Jessica, and Brittany. Professor Williams was there with other faculty members, and she spotted Dr. Rodriguez sitting near the back. At 2 p.m. sharp, Dave took the podium to introduce the panel. "Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Veterans Day presentation, Service and Sacrifice: Veterans' Voices in the Modern Era. Today we have 5 veterans representing different conflicts and different perspectives on military service." He introduced each panel member in chronological order of their service. James Thompson spoke first about World War II, his voice strong despite his age as he described the sense of duty that led him to enlist at 17. The audience listened respectfully, their expressions reflecting the reverence typically shown to greatest generation veterans. Carol Chen followed with her experiences as a Navy logistics officer during the Gulf War. She spoke about the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated environment and the pride she felt in contributing to the mission despite facing skepticism from some colleagues. Robert Williams gave a powerful presentation about his infantry service in Iraq, describing the complexity of modern warfare and the difficulties of transitioning back to civilian life. His words resonated with the audience, and Sarah saw several students taking notes. Dave spoke about Vietnam and the hostile reception many veterans of that conflict received upon returning home. He drew parallels between past and present attitudes toward military service, emphasizing the importance of separating support for troops from opinions about military policy. Then it was Sarah's turn. She approached the podium with her notes in hand, looking out at the packed auditorium. Her eyes briefly met Emma's in the front row, then found Marcus sitting with his arms crossed in the middle section. "Good afternoon," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer with the Army. But before I tell you about my military service, I want to tell you about something that happened in a classroom right here on this campus." She described the sociology class discussion about women in combat roles, not naming names but accurately recounting the assumptions and dismissive comments she had heard. The auditorium was completely silent as she spoke. "I sat in that classroom listening to my classmates debate whether women could handle real combat, whether we were strong enough, brave enough, qualified enough to serve alongside men in dangerous situations. They spoke about us as theoretical concepts, as statistics to be analyzed, as barriers to be overcome." Sarah paused, looking directly at Marcus. What they didn't know was that one of the women they were debating was sitting right there in the classroom, listening to them question her capabilities and her experiences. She saw Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat, beginning to understand where this was going. "For the past 3 months, I've sat in classes where professors and students discussed military service, veteran experiences, and women's roles in combat as abstract topics for academic analysis. I've listened to assumptions about what veterans look like, who serves in combat roles, and what kinds of experiences count as real military service." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I've heard classmates dismiss contemporary war poetry as too emotional, not knowing that some of those poems helped me process my own experiences with loss and trauma. I've listened to debates about military strategy from people who've never left their home state, let alone served in a combat zone." The audience was transfixed, many students realizing for the first time that they might have a veteran in their midst. Sarah saw Emma's eyes widen with recognition and dawning understanding. "I enlisted in the Army when I was 19, 2 years out of high school. I wanted to serve my country and prove that I could handle any challenge. During my 3 deployments to Afghanistan, I led convoys through hostile territory, cleared improvised explosive devices, and engaged in firefights that tested every limit I thought I had." Sarah described her experiences without graphic detail, but with enough specificity to convey the reality of her service. She talked about the weight of responsibility she felt for her soldiers' safety, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and the bonds forged with fellow service members that transcended gender. "I served alongside men and women who judged me not by my gender, but by my competence, my courage, and my commitment to the mission. My fellow soldiers didn't care whether I fit someone's idea of what a combat veteran should look like. They cared whether I could do my job and whether they could count on me when things got dangerous." She paused to look around the auditorium, making eye contact with as many audience members as possible. "But when I came here to pursue my education, I discovered that my fellow students had very different ideas about women's capabilities and veteran experiences. I became invisible not because I was hiding, but because people couldn't see past their assumptions about what a combat veteran looks like." Sarah's voice carried a note of challenge as she continued. "To the student who said women aren't built for real combat, I carried the same equipment, faced the same dangers, and made the same sacrifices as my male counterparts. To those who dismissed veteran poetry as too emotional, our art reflects our truth, and that truth deserves respect even if it makes you uncomfortable." She looked directly at Emma, her voice softening slightly. "And to those who advocate passionately for women's equality while failing to recognize the women who have already broken barriers, look around you. The women you're fighting for might be sitting right next to you." The auditorium remained completely silent as Sarah approached her conclusion. "I'm not telling you this story to make you feel guilty or to dismiss your perspectives. I'm telling you because recognition matters. Visibility matters. When you honor veterans, remember that we come in all genders, all backgrounds, all sizes. When you discuss military service, remember that real veterans might be listening. When you advocate for women's equality, remember that some of us have already proven ourselves in ways you might not expect." Sarah stepped back from the podium to thunderous applause. As she returned to her seat, She saw tears in several audience members' eyes. Emma was staring at her with amazement and what looked like admiration. Even Marcus appeared shaken by the revelation. Dave returned to the podium to facilitate the question and answer session. The first question came from a young woman Sarah didn't recognize. Ms. Martinez, how did you find the strength to keep your experiences private while listening to people make assumptions about your service? The aftermath of the panel was unlike anything Sarah had expected. As the auditorium emptied, several students approached her with genuine curiosity and respect. Their questions were thoughtful, their attitudes completely different from the dismissive assumptions she'd endured for months. Emma was the first to reach her, her eyes bright with excitement and something that looked like awe. Sarah, I can't believe you've been sitting in our classes this whole time and I never knew. I feel like such an idiot for all those times I talked about women in combat like it was theoretical. You weren't an idiot, Sarah replied gently. You just didn't know. That's why I decided to speak up. Would you be willing to let me interview you for my thesis? Emma asked eagerly. I mean, if you're comfortable with it. I've been trying to find female combat veterans to speak with, and you've been right there all along. Sarah smiled at the irony. I'd be happy to help with your research. Marcus approached more hesitantly, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. Sarah, I owe you an apology. All those things I said about women not being cut out for combat, I had no idea you were sitting right there. Now you know better, Sarah said simply, extending her hand. Marcus shook it gratefully, the gesture feeling like the beginning of mutual respect. Professor Williams waited until the students had dispersed before approaching. Sarah, that was an incredibly powerful presentation. I had no idea about your background. It certainly explains why you always seemed so thoughtful during our discussions about trauma and PTSD. I wanted to contribute to those discussions, Sarah admitted, but I wasn't ready to share my story until now. Well, I hope you'll feel comfortable participating more openly in future classes. Your perspective would add tremendous value to our academic discussions. As Sarah gathered her things, Dave Harrison approached with obvious pride. How do you feel? He asked. Different, Sarah said after thinking for a moment. Lighter, maybe. Like I don't have to carry a secret anymore. That's the goal, Dave said with a smile. Owning your story instead of letting it own you. Dr. Rodriguez caught up with Sarah as she left the auditorium. I'm so proud of you, she said warmly. That took tremendous courage. It felt like the right time, Sarah replied. I was tired of being invisible. You certainly won't be invisible anymore, Dr. Rodriguez observed with a knowing smile. The next few days brought a series of unexpected interactions that confirmed Dr. Rodriguez's prediction. Walking across campus, Sarah noticed that students who had never acknowledged her before now smiled and nodded in recognition. Faculty members who had previously seen her as just another non-traditional student now engaged her in conversations about her perspectives and experiences. In her psychology class on Wednesday, Professor Williams asked if Sarah would be willing to share her insights during their discussion of combat-related PTSD. For the first time, Sarah spoke up about the realities of trauma and recovery, offering first-hand perspective that enriched the academic discussion. The textbook makes it sound like PTSD is something that happens to you, Sarah explained to her attentive classmates. But recovery is something you actively work on every day. It's not just about managing symptoms. It's about rebuilding your identity and finding your place in civilian life. Marcus, who had been quietly attentive since the panel, raised his hand. Sarah, what was the hardest part of transitioning from military to college life? Sarah appreciated the genuine nature of his question. Honestly, feeling like I had to hide who I was to fit in. I thought my military experiences would make people uncomfortable, or that they wouldn't be able to see past the veteran label to see me as just another student. But now? Asked Jessica, who had also seemed transformed by the panel revelation. Now I realize that my experiences are part of what I bring to these discussions. I don't have to choose between being a veteran and being a student. I can be both. The transformation was even more evident in her American literature class. When Professor Davis resumed their discussion of war poetry, the conversation had a completely different tone. Now that we've heard from actual veterans, Professor Davis began, looking at Sarah with respect, I'm curious about your thoughts on the contemporary war poetry we've been reading. Brittany, who had previously dismissed veteran poets as lacking artistic merit, seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's perspective. "Do you think the rawness that I criticized actually serves a purpose?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Those poems gave me language for experiences I couldn't express on my own. When I read Brian Turner or Kevin Powers, I see my own struggles reflected in their words. The emotional directness isn't a flaw, it's the whole point." "I think I understand that now," Brittany admitted. "I was approaching it as literary criticism when I should have been approaching it as human experience." The most meaningful change came during Sarah's sociology class the following week. Emma had requested permission to present some preliminary findings from her thesis research, including excerpts from her interview with Sarah. "One of the things I've learned," Emma told the class, "is that my assumption about advocacy was incomplete. I thought I was fighting for women's equality in male-dominated fields, but I wasn't recognizing the women who had already achieved that equality." She looked at Sarah with gratitude. "Sarah has helped me understand that sometimes the barriers aren't just about access. They're about recognition and visibility. Some women have already broken through the glass ceiling, but their achievements get overlooked because they don't match our expectations." Tyler, their former group partner, raised his hand. "How do we do better? How do we avoid making the same assumptions?" Sarah answered thoughtfully. "Ask questions instead of making statements. Listen more than you speak, and remember that the people you're discussing might be listening." The ripple effects of Sarah's revelation extended beyond her immediate classmates. Word spread through the campus community, and she began receiving invitations to speak at other events and participate in discussions about veteran affairs and women's issues. The campus counseling center asked her to consider peer counseling for other student veterans. The Women's Studies Department invited her to guest lecture about military service and gender equality. Even the local newspaper requested an interview about the challenges facing female veterans in higher education. "I never expected this much attention," Sarah confided to Dr. Rodriguez during their next session. "Part of me misses being anonymous. But do you regret speaking up?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "No, I don't regret it. For the first time since I started college, I feel like I belong here. Not because I'm fitting into someone else's expectations, but because I'm being authentic about who I am." "And how has that changed your relationships with your classmates?" "They see me differently now, but in a good way. Instead of being the quiet older student who doesn't quite fit in, I'm Sarah, who happens to be a veteran. My military experience is part of my identity, but it's not the only thing people see when they look at me." The semester continued with Sarah finding her voice in discussions, contributing perspectives that her professors and classmates valued, and building genuine friendships with people who now knew and appreciated her full story. Emma's thesis research flourished with Sarah's participation, leading to a deeper friendship built on mutual respect rather than assumptions. Marcus became an unlikely ally, often asking thoughtful questions about military service and veteran issues. Even Brittany approached literature discussions with newfound humility and curiosity. As finals week approached, Sarah reflected on the transformation her college experience had undergone. The anxiety and frustration that had dominated her first semester had been replaced by confidence and engagement. She was no longer invisible, no longer hiding behind other people's assumptions about who she was supposed to be. During her last therapy session of the semester, Dr. Rodriguez asked Sarah what she had learned from the experience. "I learned that authenticity is worth the risk," Sarah said. "I spent so much energy trying to be who I thought other people wanted me to be, that I forgot the power of just being myself. My military service isn't something I need to hide or apologize for. It's something that makes me uniquely qualified to contribute to discussions and relationships." "And what about the future?" Sarah smiled confidently. "I'm looking forward to next semester. For the first time since I started college, I'm excited about the conversations we'll have and the perspectives I can share. I'm not worried about fitting in anymore, because I've learned that bringing my authentic self to these spaces makes them better." The final panel evaluation from Dave Harrison confirmed what Sarah already knew. Her presentation had been one of the most impactful in the program's history. Students and faculty continued to reference her words in discussions throughout the remainder of the semester. As Sarah packed up her apartment for winter break, she came across the photos she'd looked at months earlier. Images of herself in combat gear juxtaposed with pictures from college events. But now the contrast didn't represent a divided identity. Instead, it showed the full scope of her experiences and the richness they brought to her current life. Sarah Martinez was no longer invisible. She was exactly who she had always been, a veteran, a student, a woman.